In a small town, one afternoon, something that would change the life of one woman forever was about to unfold. She was caught in the act of adultery, an unforgivable crime in the eyes of the townspeople. The accusers, filled with anger and judgment, dragged her out into the middle of a bustling crowd. Her heart pounded in her chest as she was forcibly pushed toward the one man who could decide her fate, Jesus. She stood there, trembling, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear. Her head was bowed low, ashamed of the sin she had committed, yet fully aware of the consequences she now faced. The crowd's eyes burned into her, their whispers and sneers filling the air. These were people who believed in justice, who believed that the law of Moses should be upheld, no matter the cost. "You know what the law says, Jesus," one of the accusers shouted, his voice filled with disgust. "She was caught red-handed. The law demands she be stoned to death. What do you say?" The woman barely dared to look up. Her tears blurred her vision, and she could hardly comprehend the chaos around her. Would this be her end? Jesus, however, was silent. He didn't immediately respond. Instead, he bent down, his finger tracing something on the ground, an action so simple, yet it sent ripples of confusion through the crowd. The tension grew. People muttered, glancing at one another, waiting. What would he say? Would he condemn her, as they expected? After a long pause, Jesus stood up and faced the crowd, his eyes filled with calm authority. His voice was gentle but powerful when he spoke. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." A stunned silence swept over the crowd. One by one, the accusers hesitated. The first man, his stone in hand, slowly lowered it, realizing the weight of Jesus' words. Then another, and another. No one could bring themselves to condemn the woman, and soon the crowd had dispersed, leaving her standing there alone, with only Jesus remaining. She looked up at him, unsure of what to do next. Was she still condemned? Would she be left to face the consequences of her actions alone? Jesus smiled, his eyes filled with compassion. "Where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she whispered. "Neither do I condemn you," he said softly, his voice full of grace. "Go and sin no more." The woman stood there, overwhelmed. In that moment, she knew her life had changed. Not only had she been forgiven, but she had been given the opportunity to begin anew. She had been shown love in the face of her failure, grace in her darkest moment. The scene was tense, as the woman stood in the center of the crowd, trembling, her hands bound. She had been caught in the act of adultery, a crime considered unforgivable by the people of her town. She could barely keep her eyes open as she looked down at the ground, feeling the weight of the judgment that hung over her like a dark cloud. The accusers, furious and self-righteous, dragged her before Jesus. They were determined to see her punished, their voices loud with anger, their hearts filled with disdain. "Jesus, according to the law of Moses, anyone who commits adultery must be stoned to death. We caught her in the act. We demand that you give a judgment," one of the accusers said, his voice dripping with venom. The words hung in the air like a heavy accusation, each one sharper than the last. The woman could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, their gazes cold and unforgiving. There was no escaping this moment. As the crowd gathered, their judgment palpable, Jesus stood there in silence. His expression remained calm, unwavering, as the harsh words from the accusers echoed through the street. He didn't react with anger or indignation. Instead, he bent down and began writing something on the ground with his finger. The crowd grew restless, the murmurs intensifying as they waited for his response. The tension in the air was thick. They had expected Jesus to take action, to either condemn the woman or stand by the law. But instead, he remained silent, his focus on what he was writing in the dirt. For what felt like an eternity, the accusers stood impatiently, glaring at Jesus, daring him to speak. But Jesus said nothing. His silence only seemed to add fuel to their rage. They had made their case, and they expected swift retribution. The woman, her heart racing, wondered if this would be her final moment. Would Jesus side with the law? Would he give them the verdict they so eagerly sought? Finally, after a long pause, Jesus stood up. He didn't shout or rebuke the crowd. Instead, he looked at them, his gaze steady and full of compassion. His voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "Let him who is without sin Cast the first stone. His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of something far deeper. In that moment, everything changed. The accusers froze, their hands still gripping the stones they had prepared for the woman. One by one, they looked at each other, their faces changing from anger to uncertainty. Slowly, the stone in the first accuser's hand lowered, his eyes meeting Jesus' gaze with reluctance. The second accuser did the same, then another, and another. The crowd grew quieter as the realization dawned on each of them. No one was without sin. No one had the right to condemn her. One by one, they turned and walked away, the stones falling to the ground in defeat. The woman remained standing, still shaken but unsure of what to do next. She glanced around, seeing that the crowd had dissolved. She had expected to die today, but instead, she was left with the one person who had the power to judge her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She looked up at Jesus, not sure if she could believe what had just happened. Could it really be true? Could she really be forgiven? Jesus, seeing her confusion and fear, smiled gently. "Where are they? Has no one condemned you?" His voice was filled with kindness and understanding. She looked around, her eyes wide with surprise. "No one, Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Jesus nodded and spoke softly. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." His words were not just a statement of forgiveness. They were a command. He was offering her a new beginning, a chance to turn away from her past and live a life free from judgment. She had expected condemnation, but what she received was grace. She stood there, overwhelmed by the power of Jesus' words. For the first time, she felt as if she were seen not just for her sin, but for the possibility of redemption. The shame she had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope. She wasn't just forgiven, she was given a fresh start. As she turned and walked away, she felt something shift within her. Jesus had not only forgiven her, he had given her the strength to change. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she had hope. Hope for a future without shame, without condemnation. She had been given a second chance, and she would not squander it. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the air felt heavy as the crowd stood in anticipation. A woman, caught in the act of adultery, had been dragged to the center of the town square right before Jesus. Her accusers, seething with anger, had presented their case, demanding immediate judgment. The law of Moses, they said, was clear. She deserved to be stoned to death. The crowd around them murmured, some eagerly waiting for Jesus' response, while others stood back, unsure of what was coming. But Jesus didn't speak right away. He didn't immediately give them the answer they expected, the judgment they were so sure he would pronounce. Instead, he knelt down and began to write something on the ground with his finger. The crowd, perplexed and confused, fell silent. What was he doing? Why wasn't he answering? For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The accusers fidgeted, shifting their weight from foot to foot, impatient for his reply. They had caught this woman in the act of her sin. She was guilty. There was no question about it. They demanded justice. But Jesus simply continued to write on the ground, his actions quiet, deliberate, almost peaceful in the midst of the chaos. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and some began to speculate about what he was doing. Some whispered that he was stalling for time, trying to figure out how to respond. Others wondered if he was intentionally avoiding the situation, perhaps hoping the crowd would lose interest. But Jesus didn't care about the crowd's expectations or their impatience. His focus was on something entirely different. He wasn't going to play by their rules or fall into the trap they had set for him. He remained calm, composed, even as the pressure to act quickly mounted. The silence grew, and with it, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The accusers stared at Jesus, now growing more agitated. "What are you waiting for?" One of them finally snapped. "The law is clear, Jesus. She deserves to be punished. Why don't you say something?" Jesus, however, remained unfazed. He didn't rush to answer, didn't give in to their demands. Instead, he stood up, his expression unchanged, and faced the crowd. The weight of his presence was undeniable. His eyes moved over the accusers, then across the crowd. Every single person in that square was waiting for him to speak, to deliver his judgment. But Jesus had something more profound in mind than simply giving them the answer they wanted. Finally, with a calm but powerful voice, he spoke, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." His words rang out like a bell, cutting through the tension in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. The crowd froze. The accusers were silent, their hands still clenched around the stones they had prepared for the woman. Jesus' words weren't just a challenge, they were a mirror, holding up the truth about everyone in that crowd. He wasn't just talking to the woman, he was talking to the whole crowd, forcing them to reflect on their own flaws, their own sins. The question hung in the air. Who among them could truly claim to be without sin? The effect was immediate. One by one, the accusers began to drop their stones. It was as if Jesus' words had broken through their hardened hearts, making them realize the truth they had been too blind to see. No one could stand there, condemning her, knowing their own guilt. First, one man turned away, his stone slipping from his hand, hitting the ground with a soft thud. Then another followed, and another. Within moments, the whole crowd began to disperse, each person walking away, leaving the woman standing alone before Jesus. They couldn't meet his gaze, because in that simple moment, Jesus had revealed their own hypocrisy. The woman stood there, stunned and unsure. She had expected to be condemned, to feel the weight of her sin and the anger of the crowd, but instead, she was met with mercy. She had been ready for death, but what she found was life and opportunity to start anew. Jesus stood tall, looking at the woman with eyes full of compassion. His silence had spoken louder than any words ever could, forcing the crowd to face their own hearts. And now, he turned his gaze to her. "Where are they?" he asked gently. "Has no one condemned you?" The woman, still trembling, looked around. The crowd had gone, and there was no one left to accuse her. She met his eyes and whispered, "No one, Lord." "Neither do I condemn you," Jesus replied, his voice soft yet full of authority. "Go and sin no more." In that moment, something inside the woman shifted. She had been given a second chance, a fresh start, free from the condemnation of others. Jesus had offered her forgiveness, not because she deserved it, but because he saw her for who she truly was, beyond her mistakes. And in his eyes, she was worth saving. The scene was chaotic. The crowd was restless, murmuring among themselves as the woman stood trembling in the center, her eyes downcast. The accusers were relentless, their voices loud, accusing her of adultery. They demanded swift justice. They wanted Jesus to make a decision immediately. After all, according to the law of Moses, the woman's fate was clear: she should be stoned to death. There was no room for debate. Or so they thought. But Jesus didn't speak. The silence was deafening. As the minutes ticked by, every single person in that crowd became more and more uncomfortable. The accusers' faces reddened with impatience. They had expected Jesus to act quickly, to give them an answer, a judgment, but there was only silence, and with each passing second, their anxiety grew. The crowd shifted, the tension thickening in the air. They were waiting for something, anything from Jesus. Surely, he must have an answer. Surely, he would condemn the woman, as they expected. She had been caught in the act, after all. There was no question about her guilt. She was a sinner. They were the righteous ones, after all. And yet, Jesus said nothing. His calm presence stood in stark contrast to the rising fury of the crowd. It wasn't that he didn't understand the gravity of the situation. It wasn't that he didn't know what they wanted. He knew exactly what they were expecting from him. But instead of rushing to give them what they wanted, he remained still, writing in the dirt with his finger. Why didn't he speak? Why didn't he take the opportunity to settle this? The accusers couldn't understand it. Their voices grew louder, pressing for a response. One man even stepped forward, his anger barely contained. "Jesus, we demand judgment. She has broken the law, and we have caught her in the act. What are you going to do about it?" But Jesus didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He didn't engage in their anger or their demands. He simply continued to write. His actions, though seemingly quiet and unhurried, were full of meaning. They were a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. As the seconds turned into minutes, the crowd's patience began to wear thin. Some of the onlookers were becoming visibly uncomfortable. They had gathered to witness a decision, to see Jesus take a side. The anticipation was palpable, but all they got was silence. The accusers began to shift from one foot to the other, their frustration mounting. They wanted action. They wanted a verdict. But Jesus wasn't following the script they had prepared for him. His silence spoke volumes, far more than any hasty judgment could have. It was as though he was waiting for something to happen, for the right moment to reveal the truth that no one could see yet. The more they pushed, the more his silence deepened. It wasn't just a refusal to answer. It was something else, something deliberate. He was making them wait, forcing them to confront their own hearts. The longer he remained silent, the more the crowd began to shift uncomfortably. The accusers, unable to bear any longer, pressed on. Are you going to answer us or not? You can't just sit there doing nothing while this woman faces death. It was at that moment, in the midst of their growing impatience, that Jesus finally stood up. The crowd fell silent, every eye now fixed on him, waiting for him to speak. His gaze swept over the accusers, each of them now feeling the weight of his presence, as if he could see right into their hearts. His voice, calm but firm, broke through the silence. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. The words hung in the air, a piercing challenge to the crowd. It wasn't just a question for the accusers, it was a question for everyone there. Jesus wasn't just addressing the woman. He was addressing the entire crowd, making them confront their own imperfections, making them realize that no one was in a position to judge. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was different, now heavy, discarded, their pride stripped away. The crowd, once eager to see justice served, now stood in silence. Jesus had turned their expectations upside down. He had made them see that no one was without sin, that they all stood on equal ground before God. Now, only the woman remained. She stood there, still trembling, unsure of what to do next. The moment of judgment had passed, but she wasn't sure whether she had been saved or merely spared. She looked up slowly, meeting Jesus' eyes for the first time. Her heart was still pounding, and her mind raced. Was she truly forgiven, or was this just an act of mercy before the inevitable punishment? Jesus smiled gently at her. His voice, now soft and reassuring, broke the silence. Where are they? Has no one condemned you? She looked around, slowly realizing that the crowd had gone, that the accusers had all disappeared. There was no one left to judge her, no one left to hold her accountable for her actions. For the first time, she felt something different relief. No one, Lord, she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with awe. Neither do I condemn you, Jesus said, his words wrapped in compassion and grace. Go and sin no more. In that moment, her world shifted. She had expected condemnation, punishment, and pain. Instead, she had received something far greater, forgiveness and a new chance. Jesus had not just spared her life. He had offered her the opportunity to change, to start anew, and to walk away from her past. As she walked away, her heart was light. The weight of her sins was gone, lifted by the simple, powerful words of Jesus. She wasn't just forgiven, she was transformed. And she would never forget the man who had looked past her mistakes and shown her the way to redemption. The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The woman, caught in the act of adultery, stood at the center, her eyes filled with shame. The accusers were furious, their hands gripping stones, ready to carry out what they believed was justice. They had demanded that Jesus give a judgment, and they expected him to side with the law of Moses, condemn the woman, and deliver the punishment she deserved. But Jesus remained calm, writing something on the ground, his silence more powerful than any words could have been. As Jesus finished speaking, declaring, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," the crowd grew still. The words rang through the air, cutting through the anger and the fervor of the accusers. There was a moment of utter silence, as though the world had stopped turning. One by one, the eyes of the crowd turned toward each other, looking for a response, but all they found was the uncomfortable truth in Jesus' words. The first accuser, his stone heavy in his hand, stepped forward, his face full of righteous anger. He had come prepared to condemn, to throw the stone with the certainty that his judgment was justified. But as soon as he heard Jesus' words, simple, yet piercing, something shifted inside him. His hand, which had been poised to throw the stone, stopped mid-motion. For a long second he stood there, his arm trembling slightly as though unsure of what to do. He looked down at the stone in his hand and slowly, almost hesitantly, let it drop to the ground with a soft thud. Without a word, he turned and walked away. The crowd watched him, confused and uncertain. Had he really let go of his judgment so easily? Would anyone else follow? The moment was heavy with anticipation. Then another accuser, his face tight with anger, stepped forward, his stone raised high, ready to carry out what he believed was the right thing. But just like the first man, as soon as he heard the weight of Jesus' challenge, he stopped in his tracks. His hand faltered, the stone wavering in the air as though its weight was too much to bear. His eyes met Jesus' calm gaze, and in that moment, something changed. His grip loosened, and the stone fell to the ground with a quiet clink. He too turned away, his head low in reflection. As the second man left, the rest of the crowd stood in stunned silence. They had come to see judgment handed down, to watch the woman punished for her sins. But Jesus' words had made them confront their own humanity, their own imperfections. One by one, the accusers dropped their stones. The certainty with which they had arrived at this moment crumbled under the weight of Jesus' challenge. They couldn't hold their stone any longer, not because they didn't believe the woman was guilty, but because they knew, deep down, that they too were flawed. Another accuser took a step forward, but the same hesitation gripped him. He looked down at the stone in his hand and, like the others before him, couldn't bring himself to throw it. He stood there for a long moment, wrestling with his pride and his anger. Then, slowly, the stone fell from his hand, and he turned away, his eyes filled with uncertainty. One by one, the rest of the crowd followed suit. The stones, once held so tightly, were left behind as each accuser silently walked away, their heads bowed, unable to face the truth Jesus had so effortlessly exposed. The crowd began to thin, and soon, there was no one left to accuse. The woman, who had been standing in the center, now found herself alone. Her heart raced, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. She looked around, and for the first time, she realized that the stones were no longer in anyone's hands. The accusers had all gone, and all that remained was silence. Jesus, still standing, turned his gaze to the woman. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. She had expected condemnation, punishment, death. But what she found was something entirely different. In that moment, she was faced not with judgment, but with mercy. Jesus had not condemned her. He had shown her grace. Jesus looked at her with gentle eyes, filled with compassion, and asked, "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" The woman's voice trembled as she answered, "No one, Lord." Jesus smiled, his voice soft but filled with authority. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." The words were simple, but they were life-changing. In that moment, the woman was not just forgiven, she was given a second chance, a fresh start. Jesus' words not only freed her from the weight of her sin, but also gave her the opportunity to turn her life around. As she walked away, she felt lighter than she had ever felt before. The burden of guilt, the shame that had been crushing her, was gone. For the first time, she could breathe freely, knowing that she had been given a second chance, a chance to live without condemnation, a chance to start anew. The woman stood there in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. The crowd that had once surrounded her, accusing her of sin, had melted away. One by one, the people who had been so eager to see her punished had left, their stones abandoned in the dirt. The tension in the air had dissipated, but in its place, there was a heavy stillness. She stood alone, except for him, the one person whose judgment truly mattered. She had expected death, she had prepared herself for the worst, but now, as the last of her accusers walked away, she couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her mind was still racing, trying to process the moment. There was no crowd to shout at her anymore, no one to condemn her. All she could hear now was the sound of her own breathing, quick and shallow, mixed with the faint rustling of the wind. She looked up, almost afraid to, unsure of what she might see. But there he was, Jesus, standing before her, calm and composed. His presence was a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. While everyone around her had been quick to judge, he had stood still, offering mercy where no one else had. For a moment, she couldn't find the words. How could she explain the flood of emotions inside her? Fear, relief, confusion, it all swirled within her, and yet she couldn't make sense of any of it. She had come face to face with death, but instead of receiving punishment, she had received something entirely different: grace. Jesus' eyes were gentle as he looked at her, not with the harshness of an accuser, but with compassion. His gaze didn't carry the weight of judgment. Instead, it seemed to offer something deeper: a chance, an opportunity for a new beginning. His calm, steady presence was a stark contrast to the storm inside her, and yet, for the first time, she felt something shift. The shame, the guilt, the weight of her past, they had all been acknowledged, but now they were starting to fade. Still, she didn't know what to do next. Was she free? Could she walk away from this moment without facing consequences? Could her life really change? Her thoughts were a blur. She had expected the worst, but what Jesus had shown her was something she had never known before. He had offered her mercy, and with that mercy came an invitation, a chance to leave her past behind and start anew. And yet, she still couldn't quite believe it. Could it really be this simple? Could she really be forgiven? Finally, Jesus spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She hesitated for a moment, still uncertain of the reality she now found herself in. Her eyes scanned the empty space around her, and for the first time, she realized that she was truly alone. The crowd had dispersed, and the only person who remained was the one who mattered most. "No one, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His smile was gentle, reassuring, as he looked at her. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Her heart felt lighter than it ever had. His words weren't just a declaration of forgiveness, they were a declaration of freedom. He wasn't just sparing her from death, he was offering her a new life. He was not looking at her for her past mistakes, but for her future potential. He had seen her sin, but he chose to see beyond it. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't being judged or condemned, she was being loved just as she was, flaws and all. It was a love that didn't ask for perfection, but instead offered the chance to change, to grow, and to live with grace. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for so long, guilt, shame, fear, began to lift. Jesus had given her a second chance, one she didn't deserve, but one she could never repay. It wasn't just the forgiveness that was so powerful. It was the love behind it, the understanding, and the invitation to live a life no longer defined by her mistakes. She looked up at Jesus, the confusion slowly fading. The question that had plagued her for so long, what next, began to feel less daunting. For the first time, she saw a way forward, a path that wasn't shadowed by guilt. It wasn't going to be easy, but she knew that with his love, she could face whatever came next. She didn't know how her life would unfold after this moment, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't walking away the same person who had stood before Jesus just moments ago. She was free not because of her own efforts, but because of his mercy. As she turned and began to walk away, she felt the weight of the past fall away piece by piece. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she had a chance, a real chance to change. The crowd had long since dissipated, leaving only the quiet, still presence of Jesus and the woman standing before him. The dust from the ground seemed to settle around them, and the tense atmosphere that had filled the air just moments ago was now replaced by an eerie calm. She stood there, still shaken, unsure of what had just happened. Her accusers had all disappeared, but she couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. She had been caught in the act of adultery, condemned with realization. The accusers, still clutching their stones, looked at each other in shock. Slowly, one by one, they began to lower their hands. First, the oldest man, his stone slipping from his fingers as he turned and walked away. Then, the others followed. Each one dropped their stone. Their heads hung in shame as they walked off, unable to cast a stone, unable to judge. Jesus remained still, his gaze never leaving the woman, his silence still as powerful as ever. But now, the silence was full of understanding. It wasn't an absence of words, it was the fullness of the truth, the weight of the moment that none of them could ignore. Finally, when all the accusers had left and the woman was left alone, Jesus spoke once more. The crowd stood frozen in time, the tension hanging so thick in the air that it felt like it might suffocate them all. The woman, trembling and filled with shame, stood in the center, vulnerable and exposed. The accusers were ruthless, demanding justice, their voices sharp with anger as they demanded that she be stoned according to the law of Moses. They had caught her in the act, and they wanted her to pay the ultimate price for her sin. But there, amidst their fury and judgment, was Jesus. His face was calm, composed, unbothered by the mob around him. For what seemed like an eternity, he remained silent, bending down and writing on the ground with his finger. The crowd, eager for action, watched him intently, growing more and more impatient. They wanted a decision, a response, something that would bring the situation to a close, but Jesus didn't respond. His silence felt like a challenge, one that no one could quite understand. Finally, after what seemed like an endless wait, Jesus stood up. His movement was deliberate, unhurried, as if the entire world could wait for his next words. The crowd, still buzzing with anticipation, fell into a hush. All eyes turned to him. What would he say? How would he respond to their demands? Was he going to follow the law and condemn the woman? Jesus looked at the accusers first, and then he scanned the crowd. His gaze was steady, piercing, but not unkind. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, so calm that it felt like it held the weight of the entire universe. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. The words cut through the tension in the air like a blade, silencing everyone instantly. They weren't what anyone expected. The accusers, who had been so sure of their righteousness, now stood motionless, unsure of how to react. What Jesus had just said wasn't just an offer of a new way of thinking, it was a challenge, an invitation to look deeper, not just at the woman in front of them, but at themselves. For a long moment, no one moved. The stones in the hands of the accusers were heavy, but not as heavy as the truth in Jesus' words. The crowd that had been clamoring for justice, that had demanded swift punishment, now found themselves caught in a moment of deep reflection. Each of them, for the first time, had to face the reality that they too were flawed. They had their own sins, their own imperfections, and in that moment, Jesus had exposed them all. One by one, the accusers slowly began to lower their stones. The oldest of them, the one who had seemed the most eager to see the woman punished, was the first to turn away. He dropped his stone, allowing it to fall softly to the ground. His head hung low in shame, his eyes unable to meet anyone's gaze. Then another accuser followed, his stone slipping from his hand and hitting the earth with a dull thud. With each stone that fell, the crowd grew quieter, more somber. It was as if Jesus' words had pierced straight through the armor of their self-righteousness. The challenge he had issued wasn't just about the woman's sin, it was about the hypocrisy of those who stood in judgment, blind to their own faults. No one dared to throw a stone. No one could. The last of the accusers finally walked away. Their stones, she felt light. The chains of condemnation, of guilt, of self-loathing had been broken. She was free. And with that freedom came the promise of something more, a life filled with grace, love, and redemption. The woman stood there, still shaken, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes were wide, filled with confusion and disbelief. A moment ago, she had been condemned, certain that the stones thrown at her would be the end of her. The crowd had been ready, their hands clenched around the stones, their voices loud and unforgiving. And yet, here she was, standing before Jesus, the one who had the power to judge, and yet he hadn't. She glanced around nervously, unsure if she was dreaming or if this moment was real. The crowd, once so eager to see her punished, had vanished. The stones, once raised to strike her, now lay discarded at her feet. All that remained was Jesus, standing tall and calm, his gaze fixed on her with such compassion that it made her heart ache. "Where are they?" Jesus asked gently, his voice a soft balm to the raw nerves that had been exposed in the chaos. "Has no one condemned you?" The woman's breath caught in her throat. She looked around, half expecting the accusers to return, ready to resume their judgment. But there was nothing. No one stood before her to cast stones. She glanced at the empty street, her mind racing. Was it really over? Was this truly happening? Had she truly been spared? No one, Lord, she finally whispered, her voice shaking as the weight of the situation began to sink in. She couldn't understand it. She had been ready for death, for the consequences of her actions, but instead, she had found something entirely unexpected: mercy. Jesus smiled at her, and it was the kind of smile that seemed to erase all the shame, all the fear, and all the pain she had been carrying. It was a smile full of understanding, full of love. And in that moment, the woman felt a warmth fill her heart, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Neither do I condemn you," Jesus said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "I do not look at your sin, but I see your potential for change. You are forgiven." The woman's eyes widened. She had expected Jesus to judge her, to hold her accountable for her actions, to call her out for the mistakes she had made. But instead, he had done something far more profound. He had looked beyond her sin and seen her potential. He had seen her heart, and in his eyes, she was more than just the mistake she had made. She was someone worthy of grace, someone who could change, someone who could be redeemed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she breathed deeply, a sense of relief washing over her. The weight she had carried for so long, the shame, the guilt seemed to lift, like a cloud drifting away. She had expected judgment, but what she had received was something far more powerful: forgiveness. Not just forgiveness in the moment, but a promise that her past did not define her. Jesus had given her a chance to start again. "Go," Jesus continued, his voice still soft but filled with purpose, "and sin no more." His words weren't just a dismissal of her past, they were a call to action. He wasn't just forgiving her and letting her go, he was urging her to change. He was offering her the opportunity to walk a new path, one that didn't lead her back to the life of sin she had known. It was a chance to rebuild, to transform, to become something more than what her past had labeled her. The woman stood still, overwhelmed by the grace and mercy that had been extended to her. She had come to Jesus expecting to face death, but instead, she was leaving with a new life, one that was full of hope and possibility. It wasn't just a second chance, it was an invitation to change, to be healed, to become whole again. As she slowly turned to walk away, she felt lighter, freer than she had in years. The burden of her past no longer weighed her down. She wasn't perfect, and she the eyes of the law, and yet, in a matter of moments, everything had changed. For the first time, she allowed herself to look up, her eyes meeting the gaze of the one person who could change everything. Jesus stood there before her, calm and composed, his presence soothing in its quiet strength. She had expected condemnation, judgment, maybe even death. But instead, he had offered something altogether different: forgiveness. Jesus, with his gentle and reassuring gaze, spoke once more. His words were not forceful, but they carried the weight of something far deeper. "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" The woman blinked, her mind struggling to comprehend the question. She looked around, as if expecting the crowd to suddenly reappear, ready to carry out their judgment. But the street was empty, save for her and Jesus. The stones that had once been gripped so tightly in the hands of her accusers now lay scattered on the ground, forgotten. No one was there to accuse her anymore. "No, Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "No one has condemned me." She couldn't believe the words as they left her lips. She had expected her life to end that day, her punishment to be swift and final. Instead, she stood before Jesus, a second chance now unfolding before her. Jesus' gaze softened, his eyes filled with compassion as he looked at her. "Neither do I condemn you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. The weight of those words hung in the air, and for the first time, the woman felt the weight of her guilt lift. Jesus wasn't looking at her for her sin, he was looking at her for who she could become. His words were not just about forgiveness. They were an invitation to change, to walk away from the life she had lived and embrace a new path. The woman stood in stunned silence, unable to fully process what had just happened. She had been caught, exposed, and yet in this moment, she found herself free. Free from the condemnation of others, free from the chains of her past mistakes. She had been given a chance she didn't deserve, and she felt a strange sense of peace begin to settle in her heart. Jesus didn't see her as her accusers had. He didn't see her sin as something to be punished. He saw her potential, the possibility for transformation that no one else had been willing to see. In that moment, she was more than the woman who had committed adultery. She was a person given the opportunity to start anew, to rebuild a life that had once seemed lost. The weight of her past off, the shame and guilt that had threatened to define her began to fade away. She no longer felt like the woman who had been dragged through the streets, condemned and forsaken. She was someone new, someone forgiven, someone loved. Jesus didn't stop at forgiveness, though. His words carried a deeper call. Go and sin no more, he said. This wasn't just a dismissal of her sins, it was a challenge to live differently. Jesus wasn't offering her a free pass to keep living in the same way. He was offering her a chance to change, to walk away from her past and step into a new future. As the woman stood there, she realized that this was her turning point. She wasn't just forgiven, she was being empowered. Empowered to move forward, to leave behind the life that had led her to this moment, and to embrace something better. She had been shown mercy, but more importantly, she had been shown a way out of the life that had held her captive. The woman looked up at Jesus, her heart swelling with gratitude. Her eyes were filled with tears, but these were not the tears of shame and fear. These were tears of relief, of newfound hope. She didn't know exactly how she would move forward or what the future would hold, but she knew one thing. Jesus had given her a second chance, a chance she could never repay, but one she would try to honor every day of her life. As she walked away, the weight of the world seemed to lift off her shoulders. For the first time, knew there would be struggles ahead. But in that moment, she knew something had changed within her. She had been forgiven, but more than that, she had been given the opportunity to live differently. And that was the greatest gift of all, the chance to begin again. The woman stood there, stunned. Her heart was racing, her mind was spinning, and the weight of everything that had just happened still hadn't fully sunk in. She had been dragged out into the street, exposed, accused, and condemned by the crowd. They had wanted her to pay the price for her sin, and for a moment, she had thought her life was over. But now, as she stood in front of Jesus, all of that seemed distant, like a nightmare that had somehow faded away. She had expected punishment, she had expected death, the law was clear, and the crowd had been so sure of her guilt. But what had happened was not what she had imagined at all. Jesus had stood in the way of judgment, and in his silence, he had made the crowd face their own hypocrisy. One by one, they had walked away, leaving her alone with him. And now, he spoke to her. His words, soft and full of compassion, cut through the tension in the air. Neither do I condemn you, he said, his voice gentle but powerful. Go and sin no more. The woman blinked, unable to fully comprehend what she was hearing. These words, neither do I condemn you, were not what she had expected. She had thought that she would be met with a harsh rebuke, a scolding, or perhaps a condemnation for her sins. But instead, Jesus had offered her forgiveness, not just in the moment, but as a gateway to a new life. Her chest tightened with emotion. For the first time, she felt free. Not free in the way she had expected, where the weight of her past would be forgotten and ignored. No, this freedom felt deeper. It was the kind of freedom that allowed her to move forward, to change, to rebuild her life. Jesus had not just let her go. He had shown her the way forward, the possibility of transformation. Go, Jesus continued, his words full of grace, but also a challenge, and sin no more. It wasn't just a dismissal of her past mistakes. It was an invitation to live differently. It was a call to change, to leave behind the actions that had led her here, to live a life that reflected the mercy she had been shown. For the first time, the woman understood. Jesus wasn't just forgiving her. He was offering her a second chance, a fresh start. He wasn't just wiping away the past. He was giving her the tools to walk away from it. She had been given a chance to make different choices, to move forward with the grace he had extended to her. The weight that had once felt like an unshakable burden was now lifting from her shoulders. She had expected to feel the full weight of her sin, but instead she felt light relief, like she had been given a new heart. The condemnation she had feared so deeply was gone. In its place was a deep, abiding peace. It wasn't just about the forgiveness she had received, it was about the new opportunity that had been placed before her. She looked up at Jesus, her eyes full of gratitude and awe. She had no idea what the future would hold or how she would walk this new path, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't walking it alone. Jesus had seen her at her lowest and still offered her grace. He had looked beyond her sin and saw the potential within her to change. He hadn't just given her forgiveness, he had given her hope. As she turned to leave, she felt a sense of renewal inside her. The guilt that had weighed on her heart for so long was gone. It wasn't just that she was forgiven, it was that she had been seen and understood. Jesus hadn't defined her by her mistakes. He had seen her for who she truly was and what she could become. With each step she took away from that place, the burden of her past seemed to fade further and further into the distance. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, she knew that. But for the first time, she felt like she could face it. She had been given a second chance, and she was determined to make the most of it. She wasn't sure what the future would look like. She didn't have all the answers. But one thing was certain. Her life had been changed, and she would never be the same. Jesus had given her a new beginning, and with that gift, she would start walking a new path on where sin no longer defined her, but where grace, hope, and transformation led the way. The woman, once condemned, now stood at a crossroads. Her heart was no longer burdened by the weight of her past, for the judgment that had loomed over her had been replaced with something far more powerful: forgiveness. Jesus has shown her mercy, and in that mercy, she found a chance to begin again. The stones, once meant to condemn her, now lay discarded, forgotten, as the crowd that had once demanded her punishment had dispersed, leaving her standing alone with the one person who had the power to truly judge her. But instead of condemnation, Jesus had given her something entirely different. He hadn't just forgiven her. He had offered her a new path, a path of healing and transformation. Go and sin no more, he had said. Those words were not just a dismissal of her sin. They were an invitation to change, to live differently, to walk away from the life that had led her to this moment. In that moment, she realized that Jesus did not see her for the mistakes she had made, but for the potential he knew she had to change. This story is more than just about a woman caught in sin. It's a story about the unconditional forgiveness that Jesus offers to anyone who is willing to repent and turn toward him. Jesus does not condemn sin. He offers a way out of it. He doesn't simply point out the mistakes we've made. He opens a new path, one filled with grace and the opportunity for healing. The woman's encounter with Jesus changed her life forever. She had come to him expecting judgment, but she left with the promise of a fresh start. Jesus doesn't just forgive. He empowers us to leave behind the chains that have held us captive. He shows us that our past does not have to define us, and he gives us the strength to walk away from the things that have kept us trapped in shame and regret. In the end, the message of this story is clear. No matter how far we've fallen, no matter how many mistakes we've made, Jesus is always ready to offer us forgiveness and the chance to start anew. His love doesn't come with conditions. It comes with the promise of transformation. Jesus doesn't condemn us for our sin. He shows us a path to healing, salvation, and redemption.